So welcome back to managerial accounting. And when you can see when you're a shark all the way. So I hope you like my nifty hat and my official Suffolk Community College shirt. Have to admit, ever since I've had to wear glasses, I think hoodies are one of the greatest inventions of all time. You got a place to put your eyeglasses while you're doing other things. So you'll see I have a series of hoodies, but my current favorite is my Suffolk County Community College. Not this hoodie, but the other one. I actually prefer the darker color, but I will go with this one for now. So the purpose of this little mini extra is not to talk about my hoodies, but to finish up chapter 2. So chapter 2, as you may recall, had to do with job order costing, which is the process by which we track material and labor and overhead to jobs. So we've done that for a manufacturer. We've got to just do two other things. Most of what we do for manufacturers, or a lot of what we do for manufacturers, is also applicable to service organizations as well. So we need to take a look at job order costing in the service industry. And then the fourth objective we need to look at is actually analyzing the costs that, that we have accumulated under job order costing. So job order costing can be used for a service business. In fact, it's very often used for a service business. We're living an example of this right now in my household. My mother-in-law is going to turn 96 on Sunday of next week, not this coming Sunday tomorrow, but the following Sunday. So we're going down to Florida to visit her for her birthday. That trip was planned a while ago, but she fell this week, last week rather, and she fractured her hip. So fortunately, it appears to be a minor fracture, but she's in the hospital. So this concept of how costs are accumulated by a hospital are very relevant to us because my wife manages, all of her medical care and so forth. So when we look at the bills from the hospital, they will create a little job order cost for Josie Orlando, my mother-in-law, and they will track to that all the different labor that has been incurred on her behalf. They'll have labor costs and they'll have other miscellaneous costs that they'll track to her care. They'll have, the cost of her room and lab tests and all that sort of stuff. So, if you think of a hospital as a service organization, they're going to have to track costs just as we would also in a manufacturing situation. So the primary cost for a service organization would be labor and overhead. Materials and supplies are usually insignificant and are attributable to additional overhead costs. So as a practical matter, what we do for a service organization is we got to figure out a way to track labor and overhead costs to a job. And we're going to have a work in process account for each job. In this case, it was a hospital, it would be each patient. And then when the job is completed and billed, we come up with the total cost of the services, and the cost of the services is similar to the cost of goods sold for a merchandising or a manufacturing business. But we don't have to maintain an actual inventory because we don't actually inventory these costs, because once the job is finished, we actually bill the customer. So the revenue and the services are recorded upon the completion of the job. So let's look how this would work for a service organization. So you'll recognize wages payable, you'll recognize supplies, you'll recognize work in process, you'll recognize overhead. What you're not seeing there is you're not seeing materials costs. So as wages are incurred in the job, they become part of work in process. As overhead is applied to the job, they become part of the work in process. And then when the job is completed, it goes to the costs of services, and then the cost of services are billed to the customer. You're not going to see an inventory account for finished goods inventory. You're not going to see an inventory account for raw materials. The only inventory account, kind of to speak, is going to be this work in process account. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. So remember that for service organizations, they track costs, same way a manufacturing would, but the costs that we track are going to be basically labor costs and overhead costs. We don't have material costs, and we don't have finished goods inventory, and we don't have raw materials inventory. The other concepts in terms of the allocating labor to work in process and allocating overhead to work in process remains the same. So quick little check here. The primary cost for a service business. What are the primary costs of a service business? Is it direct materials and labor? Well, it can't be direct materials because Service organization doesn't have direct materials. So you can delete A and you can delete B because it makes direct reference to direct materials. Direct labor and overhead costs, that sounds pretty good. That sounds just like what we did in the little flow chart there. So I'm going to say it's C, but for completeness, let's take a look at D. Direct labor and indirect labor. Well, indirect labor would become part of overhead. So the better answer I'm going to believe is C, and the struggling graduate students who put together this question agree with us that the primary cost for a service provider would be direct labor and overhead. Right, so that's objective 3. Now let's take a look briefly at objective number 4. So this is analysis for decision making, analyzing job. Let me move my head out of the way. Job costs. So analyzing job costs. How do we analyze costs? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to accumulate the cost over time. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those costs and review those costs and compare the jobs and ask ourselves, well, did we do a better job on managing costs on one job than we did on the other? So let's take a look at our old buddy here, Legend Guitars. So they use direct materials in both job 54 and 63. Both jobs produce the same number of guitars, so you would think that direct material cost per unit should be the same. However, when comparing the two jobs, we find that the cost per job, the cost per guitar in terms of materials for job 54 was $100, and for job 63, it was $125. So the material cost per job are significantly higher for job 63 than they are for job 54. Well, how is that possible, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So we take a look at job 54, and job 54, they used maple, direct material maple wood. So there was 400 board feet used at a materials price of $10. So we used $4,000 worth of materials on that job. We produced 40 guitars, so the material costs are $100 a guitar. 4,000 divided by 40 gives us $100. Now, look what happened in job 54. Same number of guitars, but we used 500 broad feet of wood. So we used a lot more wood. The cost remained $10. So we spent $5,000 worth of materials. So the cost of materials per guitar here is $25 higher than it is for the job 54. If you set that up as a fraction, $25 higher divided by $100. So the materials cost are 25% higher. That is significant, and we ought to explore that and see why that happened. Okay, so a couple of things here. It wasn't the cost of the material, because the cost of the material was still $10 a broad foot, as you see in bullet point there, number 2. So possible explanation. So what are some of the things that we could investigate? We might find that a new employee was not properly trained. So he or she, when cutting the wood, may have had a lot of scrap and waste. Maybe some of the wood came from a new supplier that may have been of poor quality, causing waste. Maybe the cutting tools on the latter job 63 were not properly maintained. Maybe the instructions to the guy cutting the wood or the woman cutting the wood were not exact, and we had to recut. So the point here in terms of analyzing costs is if you find a significant difference in comparing jobs, you ought to investigate why the costs are higher. These are some of the possible explanations. Okay. So in summary, at this point, you should be able to describe the whole chapter as a whole, cost systems used by manufacturing. And again, that's the process. We use the job order cost cards to keep track of materials, labor, and overhead. You ought to be able to illustrate the job order costing for a manufacturing business. So that means you ought to be able to do the journal entries to record the purchase of materials, to record the application of labor to jobs, to record the application of materials to job, the application of overhead to jobs, the transfer from work in process to finished goods, and then the transfer out of finished goods to cost of goods sold. So best way I think to do this is to be able to do the journal entries. So if you look at the exercises that we did in class, all the exercises, I think there were like 6 or so of them, all of them have to do with the first 2 objectives. So we don't have any exercises for the last objective, but describe job order costing for a service business. It's basically the same with 2 exceptions. One, we don't have direct materials cost, and the second is we don't have finished goods inventory. And describe the use of job order costing for decision making. So what we do is we compare the costs of jobs And then we can take a look based on how many goods were manufactured, the cost per unit of materials, cost per unit of labor, cost per unit of overhead, and we can examine any of the differences and try to figure out what's going on. Okay, so this concludes chapter 2. If you haven't done so already, please do the homework, and we will look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. And once you finish the homework from chapter 2, go on and read chapter 3. So until next time, adios, au revoir, hasta luego. And we will join throughout the semester various guests. So Mr. Spock wishes you would do. Live long and prosper. If you don't know who Mr. Spock is, Google. Live long and prosper. See you, folks. Enjoy your weekend.